The 1980s were a decade of bold fashion, big hair, and, let's face it, envy-inducing toys and gadgets. Rich kids seem to have it all. Luxury brand sneakers, Atari gaming systems, high-tech Walkmans, and even their own personal computers. Admit it, you wanted all those shiny, expensive things too. The Walkman. Back in the 80s, having a Sony Walkman was like having your personal soundtrack. Portable music was a game changer, and only the kids whose parents shelled out the cash could be seen walking around with headphones on, jamming to their favorite cassette tapes. For the rest of us, we had to stick to boomboxes, or worse, waiting for our favorite song to come on the radio. Atari and Nintendo. If you grew up in the 80s, you probably remember the allure of the Atari 2600, or the iconic Nintendo Entertainment System, NES. Rich kids had them hooked up to their TVs and spent their weekends playing Pac-Man, Donkey Kong, and Super Mario Bros. While most of us could only play these games at a friend's house or in arcades, those with a gaming console at home were the envy of the entire neighborhood. Brand name sneakers. In the 80s, having the right pair of shoes was everything. Rich kids were sporting Nike Air Jordans or Reebok pumps, while the rest of us made do with whatever we could find on sale. Those flashy sneakers not only looked cool, but made a bold statement of status. Owning a pair felt like you had entered an elite club, and let's be honest, many of us dreamed of it. Cabbage Patch Kids. These soft, chubby-cheeked dolls were the it toy of the decade, and they were hard to find, unless your parents were willing to pay top dollar. Rich kids had multiple Cabbage Patch Kids, while many of us only dreamed of adopting one of these quirky characters. If you were lucky, you might have gotten your hands on one after the craze died down. Personal computers. Before PCs became commonplace, only the wealthy could afford to have a personal computer at home. Whether it was an Apple II or a Commodore 64, rich kids got to explore the early world of gaming, coding, and computing. The rest of us were left to use school computers, or worse, just imagine what it was like to type away on a fancy machine at home. Designer clothing. If there was one thing that separated the rich kids from everyone else, it was their clothes. Brands like Ralph Lauren, Lacoste, and Guess were huge in the 1980s. Those with money walked around with their polo shirts and designer jeans, while the rest of us settled for knockoffs or whatever was on sale at the local department store. Big wheels and BMX bikes. Rich kids in the 80s rode around in style, especially on their big wheels trikes or BMX bikes. The rest of us had to watch from the sidelines, or if we were lucky, borrow a ride from a friend. BMX bikes, in particular, were a status symbol. Owning one meant you had the freedom to explore your neighborhood in the coolest way possible. Memberships to fancy clubs. Some kids spent their summers swimming in the neighborhood pool, but the rich kids were lounging at country clubs. They had memberships that allowed them access to tennis courts, private swimming pools, and fancy dining. It was a world that felt so far out of reach for most of us, but boy, did we dream of belonging to that exclusive group. If you're enjoying this nostalgic look back at the 1980s, I'd love to have you as part of my community. Please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel for more fun, memory-filled content. Remote control cars. In the 80s, remote control cars were the ultimate toy for kids, but they weren't cheap. The rich kids had the most high-tech versions that could race at incredible speeds, while the rest of us were stuck with wind-up toys or simpler, cheaper models. Watching a rich kid zoom their remote control car around the park was both thrilling and a little heartbreaking. Private ski trips and vacations. For many families in the 80s, vacations meant a road trip to the nearest beach or camping site. But rich kids went on ski trips to Aspen or fancy vacations to Disney World. They came back from winter break with stories of snowboarding, skiing, and staying in luxurious lodges, while the rest of us could only listen and wish. VCRs and VHS collections. Before streaming or even DVDs, having a VCR was a big deal. Rich kids had the latest VHS movies in their collections, and they didn't have to wait for them to come on TV. Whether it was E.T. or Back to the Future, they had access to movies on demand, while the rest of us had to hope for a good weekend movie marathon on cable. Boomboxes. While many of us made do with a simple radio or a cheap cassette player, rich kids had the full-blown boomboxes. They were flashy, loud, and the ultimate way to blast your favorite mixtapes. These massive portable stereos became a symbol of status, especially when paired with the latest music cassettes. Electric scooters. Remember seeing that one kid zipping down the street on an electric scooter? If you did, chances are they were one of the rich kids. While most of us were content with our push scooters or bikes, the electric scooter was the futuristic, envy-worthy toy that made heads turn. ColecoVision. If Atari and Nintendo weren't enough, the ColecoVision gaming console was another toy that only the wealthiest families seemed to own. It was one of the most advanced systems at the time, and with games like Donkey Kong and Zaxxon, it quickly became the holy grail of gaming for rich kids. Leather jackets. In the 80s, nothing screamed cool quite like a leather jacket, especially if it was real leather. The rich kids wore designer versions, styled like they were fresh off the set of Top Gun. The rest of us had to settle for faux leather or hand-me-downs that didn't quite have the same appeal. Lego sets. While most of us were lucky to get a basic Lego set, rich kids had the gigantic ones. Castle sets, pirate ships, and even entire cityscapes. These sets were expensive, intricate, and took hours to build, but they were every kid's dream. Watching a rich kid pull out their massive Lego collection felt like watching a magician at work. Swatch watches. 1980s, Swatch watches were not just timepieces, they were fashion statements. Rich kids collected these colorful, quirky watches and wore them as accessories. Some even wore two at a time to show off their collection. Meanwhile, most of us had just one, if any. Teddy Ruxpin. This talking bear was more than just a toy. It was a storytelling companion. Teddy Ruxpin could read books out loud when you inserted a cassette tape into his back, and he quickly became a symbol of wealth in the toy world. Not everyone could afford one, and those who did were the envy of their classmates. Trapper keepers. While many of us had plain old notebooks and folders for school, the rich kids had trapper keepers. These brightly colored, patterned binders with Velcro closures were the ultimate in school supplies. They weren't just practical, they were a status symbol, and every kid wanted one. Airline travel. Flying in the 1980s wasn't as common as it is today, and it was usually considered a luxury. Rich kids spent their summers jetting off to exotic destinations, while the rest of us were taking road trips in the family station wagon. The idea of flying to Disneyland or some tropical paradise was the ultimate dream. Rollerblades. Before inline skates became mainstream, rich kids were zooming around on their sleek rollerblades, while the rest of us stuck to our traditional four-wheel skates or skateboards. Those on rollerblades seemed like they were from the future. Luxury lunchboxes. It may sound simple, but even lunchboxes were a status symbol in the 80s. Rich kids had the most up-to-date themed lunchboxes, often featuring characters from the latest hit movies like Star Wars or Indiana Jones. These weren't your run-of-the-mill plastic containers, they were collectible, and everyone wanted one. Mopeds. Owning a moped was like having the coolest toy in the world for a kid in the 80s. Rich kids got to ride around on their mopeds while the rest of us pedaled away on our bikes. Mopeds gave them a sense of independence and freedom that most of us could only dream about. Fancy lunches. While many kids brought peanut butter and jelly sandwiches to school, rich kids had gourmet-packed lunches. Their brown bags were filled with exotic snacks, high-end lunch meats, and name-brand treats that made the rest of us look at our sand wedges with envy. Go-karts. Rich kids didn't just ride bikes, they had go-karts. These mini racing cars were the ultimate outdoor toy, and owning one meant endless hours of fun speeding around the neighborhood. They weren't cheap though, and only a select few kids had the privilege of racing in style. Memberships to video rental clubs. In the 80s, renting movies was a huge deal. But rich kids had memberships to video rental clubs that gave them exclusive access to the latest VHS releases. While the rest of us waited in line at the local rental store, they were already watching the latest films at home. camcorders. Home video recording became popular in the 1980s, but camcorders were expensive. Only rich kids had access to these bulky but cutting-edge devices. They would record family vacations, school events, and even their own home movies, something most of us could only dream about. Electric typewriters. Before computers became common, the electric typewriter was a luxury item for many households. Rich kids used them for school reports and projects, while the rest of us made do with manual typewriters or handwritten assignments. The smooth, modern feel of an electric typewriter was definitely something to envy. Arcade machines at home. While most kids had to go to the arcade to play their favorite games, some rich kids actually had arcade machines at home. Imagine walking into a friend's house and seeing a Pac-Man or Galaga machine right in their living room. Mind-blowing, right? Looking back, it's fascinating to see how the material things of the 80s shaped our childhood desires. While many of these items were out of reach for most of us, they certainly sparked a sense of wonder and excitement. These days, we can smile at the memories and realize that, while those rich kids may have had the coolest stuff, the friendships and fun we created with what we had were priceless.